So what is my take on emulation? Emulation is almost a dirty word when it comes to video game collecting because it defeats the entire point. Because, for example, I make a video about all these games that I've collected and how some of them are pretty expensive. Like, there's hundreds of pounds worth of games just between those 9, right? But you can play every single one of those for free if all you have is a PC. You just can. However, there is a benefit to emulation in more than just, being able to save money. It's a case of, in reality, some of these games are difficult to come by these days, and is it more valuable to the gaming industry that people are able to access and play games that are, at this point, starting to just completely disappear because of their lack of support in keeping up with history? This is the problem that so many of the Silent Hill games have got, where they're all bound to the systems they were released on and were not made backwards compatible. Or if they did get a HD remaster, like this one, it wasn't a very good one because it stripped everything that made the game the game. So I'm definitely not anti-emulation. I think it's just, like most things, a preference thing. I think that emulation is just fine, provided you're playing something that, isn't gettable in modern day very easily. Something I don't really understand is emulation of PS3 era and beyond. I know that there's a PlayStation 3 emulator, and I don't really entirely see the point behind doing that, because PS3s cost not a lot, and they connect up to modern hardware perfectly because they're on HDMI and not component or composite. They're already in HD, they already play off the disc just fine with modern controls. It's not like they're janky like old school PlayStation 2 games or PlayStation 1 games might be. So when I hear that people are emulating PlayStation 3 games, I kind of just think, what's the point? Because most PlayStation 3 games are not stupidly expensive these days, they're not difficult to get hold of, and they connect up very easily. Whereas PlayStation 2 on most modern TVs looks ugly, and you've got to spend a fortune to make it not look ugly. For example, let me show you something. I've shown this off in videos before, but this is the RetroTink 5X. It's the device that I use to upscale my PlayStation 2 to 1440p. And it cost like 320 quid or something like that. For that price, you could get several PlayStation 2s and PlayStation 3s. You see what I mean? So I understand that I get the need to emulate PlayStation 2 and back. I also understand DS stuff as well. DS stuff and Game Boy stuff is arguably one of the biggest use cases for me when it comes to emulation, although it's something that I could never personally do because it bothers me. I'm one of those people that if it's there, I'll do it. And for example, anytime I've ever emulated a Pokemon game in my entire life, I always end up using this, you know how you can hold spacebar to play in 200% speed? Well, then you end up just smashing through all of the wild encounters and becoming over-leveled. I can't stop myself doing that, so I don't. And I also enjoy the feel of handheld sometimes. For example, I've got a whole wall of handheld consoles, so when I want to do this, let me show you those. So over here we've got my handhelds. So you've got my Game Boy Advance SP, that's the one that I've had. All of these consoles are actually from when they came out. None of them were collected, they were just stuff that I've had since release. So there's my Game Boy Advance SP, there's my original Game Boy. So this Game Boy can play DS games and Game Boy games as well. On a bigger screen and arguably more comfortably. Then you've got my DSi XL, which is probably my favourite DS, and I'll get to something about that in a moment. And then on the right we've got my 2DS, which we've basically just used for Pokemon Sun and Moon, I'm pretty sure. Something else that I suppose I am a little bit guilty of doing when it comes to this is I will put Game Boy games and DS games that I don't have on an R4 card to play them through my DS, which is kind of emulation. It's still using a ROM. 99% of the time I've ever emulated anything ever, it's a game that I already own. For example, I have a PC over there, it's hooked up to this TV as well, with a 3080 Ti in, and I don't really use my PC for gaming almost ever because I'm just I just kind of prefer the ease of a console, especially when it comes to recording them. But the first thing that I played on that PC when I got that 3080 Ti was I used an emulator called DuckStation, which is a PlayStation 1 emulator that works amazingly. And I emulated Resident Evil 1 from 1995, I want to say, on a 3080 Ti. If there was ever the definition of the word overkill, it really might be there. Also, apparently about 50% of the people that watch these videos are not already subscribed, so if you guys could fix that, because we're trying to get to 10,000 subscribers, that'd be great. Today's going to be a really rather busy day for me. I'm going to have to record 6 videos, because over the next 2 days I'm not going to be able to record at all, because there's going to be workmen in my office doing things. Once it's done, I will show you what's been done, but it's going to be some quality of life upgrades. Once I've finished recording this couple of videos, I'm off to go travelling for another CEX haul video, because it needs to be done. So let's talk about your use case choices for emulation and consoles and what you can use. So another thing that I do sometimes do is if a game has a PlayStation 2 and a GameCube release, I will often emulate it on Dolphin. So Dolphin is the GameCube emulator. And the reason that I do that is because the GameCube emulator just seems to work so much better than PCSX2, which is the PS2 emulator. I have never really gotten along very well with PlayStation 2 emulators, even though I know that they're like arguably the most commonly used emulators outside of maybe the DS ones. But it just never feels right to me. It almost feels like the input on the stick isn't one-to-one with what the input should be on the screen, or what it would have been had I been playing natively on a console. Or it seems that I'm trying to play games that just have problems, like graphical errors, or things where the cutscenes don't work properly. Or you know how in PCSX2 half of the selling point is that you can upscale it to like 4K, but then some games it doesn't let you do that because you have to use the software renderer, not the hardware renderer, and then you're just basically seeing it as it would have been shown on a PlayStation 2 as well. And at that point, again, am I really winning here through using an emulator? So I've never really seen much use for me anyway in emulating PS2 stuff, and that was before I even had like this setup where I could play my PS2 and it still be pretty. Like even when I just had a PS2 and couldn't really hook it up to a modern TV because it didn't look right. So these days, if I'm going to emulate, my favourite things I'm going to do is DuckStation for PlayStation 1, Dolphin for GameCube, and then I will emulate through an R4 card, through an emulator that I've put onto the R4 card, so that I can play any Game Boy game. Even on my, for example, I can play Game Boy games on my 2DS, even though there's no Game Boy Advance slot, and that's pretty fun because it's the biggest screen you can really get, so it's still handheld format, but playing Game Boy games. And I'm only ever really emulating stuff I already own. So like a couple of years ago I played through all of the Mega Man Battle Network collection games, and that was fun. That was before they even released the HD remaster. Didn't know they were doing it. And in fact it probably would have been a massive quality of life upgrade had I done that, but it wasn't a thing. Or sometimes what I'll do is I'll emulate the inverse version of whatever Pokemon game I'm going to play. So for example, I own Leaf Green physically. I have Leaf Green, but I wanted to play Fire Red because I'd never played Fire Red. So I got the ROM of Fire Red and stuck it on my R4 card and played it that way. Or I have Pokemon Pearl and I have Pokemon Platinum, but I wanted to play Pokemon Diamond, so again, emulate Diamond. And to hammer this point home, I have Pokemon Sapphire and I have Pokemon Emerald, but I wanted to play Pokemon Ruby. You get the gist. For me, obviously people can do what they want. No one's ever going to stop anybody doing what they want. No one's ever going to stop emulation full stop. It just isn't going to happen. And I think these days, Sony and Microsoft are starting to work with emulation companies to help make things more easily accessible, backwards compatible on like modern consoles. So we're kind of bridging that gap. But for me, even though it feels like sometimes it's like collectors versus emulating community because of this whole, well, we didn't have to pay for it and it looks better versus you had to pay for it and it looks worse. For me, I do a mixture of both. Most of the time I will play things natively, but because I will often want to play the best experience of a version that I can, if I know that a GameCube version of a game exists, I might emulate that. If I want to do something slightly different or mod it in any way, then I might emulate it, even though I already own it. 99% of the time that I ever emulate anything is a game that I already own in some form or fashion, because I just own the majority of the games that I care to have ever played. Like, despite the fact that it does seem like I buy games non-stop, I do genuinely try not to buy things that I don't actually have intention on playing at any point or have previously played before. And I think largely emulation is a good thing for the gaming industry because it preserves gaming. I think there's probably like a lot of younger game enthusiasts that are able to play games that they otherwise wouldn't have ever been able to play if it wasn't for emulators. Like if it wasn't for emulators and people like creating upscaled versions of like the original Resident Evils and Silent Hills, I'm not sure people would still be bothered about them at all. Like if you're an 18-year-old watching this and you have played Silent Hill, I'm willing to bet that the reason you have played Silent Hill is probably through an emulator, because if you didn't, it would have been rather hard to get hold of, or just something that is kind of outside your scope because of the prohibitive cost of native hardware and making it work in a way that isn't awful these days. Like I know that when I was younger, my first move would have been to emulate, whereas now I like having these things, so if I can, I will, you know? And I think that having ROMs really long term is a great thing for games, because at the end of the day, even these physical games are not forever. Everything does have a bit of a shelf life in terms of disc. Like discs will eventually biodegrade, whereas if the games are available digitally online, that at least preserves them. I'm sure that there is probably some way of taking that ROM and burning it to a real disc so that you could probably play it physically if you wanted to. It wouldn't be a release copy, it wouldn't be a legit copy, but there is going to come a time at some point, decades down the line, where this might be the only way of playing these games if the actual developers and creators of the games themselves don't support them. Because, for example, very easily, some of the games that I own are probably pushing 25, maybe even 30 years old, some of the PlayStation 1 stuff. And it's like, at what point will those discs, no matter how good of a condition they are kept in, no matter how well preserved they are, at what point will they just degrade to a point where they're no longer usable at all? And at that point, once all of these copies are just forever wrecked because time destroys everything at some point, then, if it wasn't for the ROMs and the emulators and things like that, I don't think it would have worked. It would just be lost to time. So I think that if you're somebody that really cares passionately about gaming, you should probably try to own things physically, just so that you can have that part of history and perhaps feel some sort of moral obligation towards doing that if you're also going to emulate, because I'll never feel bad for emulating any of my PS2 stuff on a GameCube because I already own the PS2 stuff. I've put the money forward, I've got the thing, I own it. You know, once you've put the money forth, I think you should be able to pretty much do what you want with it, provided it's like legally. So yeah, that's my thoughts on emulation. Let me know if you agree or disagree on what you think. I think I pretty much covered it in about as fair of a way as is possible when it comes to these takes. And 5 more videos today. It's going to be a long one. I'm going to be sweating by the end of it, so nobody better comment about the fact that I'm going to look exactly the same for all of these videos. Anyway, see you in a bit. Bye-bye.